let's see. Okay, please go ahead and start.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for coming. I'm excited to present on some of this today. So yeah, it's just going to be sort of a short tutorial on Bayesian data analysis. And well, let's see, get my slides to work. And so the general outline for today, I wanted to kind of start because I think a lot of people don't really start kind of from the Bayesian perspective. We sort of start with sort of classical frequentist stats and then get introduced to Bayes later. And so I think with that comes some conceptual barriers that I'd like to just point out. And so I'll start there and then talk about what I think sort of the core of the Bayesian philosophy is, which I'll term generative thinking. And then I'll go through sort of a workflow of how you might apply some of these methods to your own data with sort of an example from some work I've done in the past. I was originally going to go through like different, like, you know, how to do a t-test or how to do a regression and some things, but as we'll see when I talk about conceptual barriers, it actually kind of worked against some of those barriers I was trying to sort of break down a little bit. And so I'm going to mostly follow one example, but try to hit on all of the core concepts throughout that example. And if you want to, I put together an R notebook and there's also an HTML file. So if you want to follow along with some of the code that I use to generate like the figures and some of the analyses, you can just take a snapshot of this QR code and this will take you to a Dropbox folder and you can go to the code folder in there and then take a look at the files there. So I'll just leave that for a sec, then I'll move on. Okay, so in terms of conceptual barriers, I think these are just some things that you tend to think of if we come from the Bayesian perspective, from the frequentist side. And these aren't necessarily untrue. It's just sometimes I think they can kind of limit what we can do with Bayes, and sort of it gets in the way of using it fully. And the first one is that Bayesian data analysis is just sort of adding priors to traditional frequentist models. And so you hear about, you know, we have a likelihood and we have a prior, and typically, you know, I can do a t-test, I can do a Bayesian t-test, I can do a Bayesian regression, ANOVA, and all I need to do is just add some prior information, and then it sort of makes it Bayesian. And it's technically true, but I think there's a lot more to doing Bayesian data analysis than just that. And it really requires us to maybe take a different perspective from some of the classical approaches. And so I hope that the example that I'll walk through today will kind of demonstrate that idea. And then another barrier, I think, is that you know, Bayesian probability or prior information in general is subjective, and it sort of just inherently biases our statistical inference. And I think a great example of this is there's a paper that came out kind of recently. You can see here, so Bayesian estimation with informative priors is indistinguishable from data falsification, right? And so I think this tends to be sort of like the snap judgment that people make, and it's like technically true. Like you can kind of you know, having really strong prior information that you might put into a Bayesian analysis can have a similar effect as sort of like making up data. But again, I think this it sort of limits how we kind of think about Bayesian modeling in general. And so I hope that going through the example today, I can sort of touch on some of these conceptual barriers and show that there's a little more to it than that. Okay, and so so then it comes to what would I say Bayesian modeling actually is. And for me, the general idea here is that we want to develop what I'll call a generative model, which I'll explain in more detail. But this is a model that can kind of reproduce data or reproduce like all of the variables that we're interested in making inference on for a given application. And so the basic sort of maybe a definition that I could give here of a generative model is a little more technical, is a single or a joint probability distribution that we can use to actually simulate forward the data that we're going to be observing in our experiment or whatever analysis that we're conducting. And within this includes a few different things, but it includes not only the observed data that we see, so like maybe behavioral responses that we get in an experiment or like self-report questionnaire types of responses that we might observe. So it not only includes that, but it also includes how the parameters of our models are distributed. And again, I know this, if for those who might be unfamiliar with Bayesian methods, some of these ideas might be a little abstract, but we'll get into sort of more concrete examples as we go on. And then finally, this includes also just all of the relationships that I'm interested in estimating. So like if I'm interested in group differences or something of that nature, kind of a generative model is a model that can kind of capture all of those things that I'm wanting to kind of understand better. Okay, and as I'm going through this, you can also feel free to ask any questions. And so one other thing to note here as we're discussing this is that the model that we develop, we want it to be sort of closely aligned with our theory that we're trying to test or sort of scrutinize as possible. And so I think that is one of the really big benefits of doing Bayesian data analysis, is that we're able to kind of develop models that more closely align with our theories. And I want to kind of walk through that today in this example to hopefully convey that to some extent. Okay, and so now in terms of like how we actually conduct Bayesian data analysis, there's actually a lot of really good papers that have come out recently on this, but on this general idea of a Bayesian workflow. And we'll sort of walk through kind of the steps that you might take when you're approaching a problem from a Bayesian perspective. And these will still be kind of conceptual, but then we'll make them concrete in the example as we go through. So the general steps are first we have to actually define that model of, you know, how basically if we can kind of create a model that can simulate data that look kind of like or similar to what we might actually observe in our experiment or our study, whatever it might be, then we have specified a generative model. So if you've ever, for example, like gone into R and simulated data from a normal distribution, you might sort of take like 10 draws or 10 samples from a normal distribution. Like that would be a normal, like a generative model of sort of observations that come from a normal distribution. And so that's the basic idea that we want to do when we specify a generative model, but we want to do it in such a way that it's kind of capturing all of the different patterns in the data that we are interested in. And so when we're talking about data, typically we'll talk about like a likelihood, and then we'll also talk about priors, which are the information that we bring to inference that specifies how the parameters in our likelihood are going to be distributed themselves. And again, I know it's kind of abstract for those who may not be familiar with some of these ideas, but we'll again get into some specific examples as we go on. So that's sort of defining what the model is the first step. And then the second step is to kind of simulate from it, right? So once we've kind of defined the model, you can actually just kind of sample from it just to see if it can generate data that looks like what we might expect. And so basically we want the model to kind of like, but before we even like fit it to data or estimate parameters of the model, we want to be sure that the model can sort of produce sort of patterns that aren't like strange in some way. And again, I know it's abstract, but we'll get to an example of where this is really important actually in our application today. And if that's not the case, like if we simulate some data from the model and it looks kind of totally unlike what we would expect it to look like, then we kind of go back to step one and rethink what we're doing. And then the actual Bayesian part comes in when we're actually estimating the parameters from these models. And so, you know, we're defining the model, we assign some prior distributions, and then what we do after that is we say, okay, now that I've defined this, what should I believe, or how should I update my priors after observing the data? And then we call those the posteriors. And that's where sort of Bayes' rule comes into play. And so after we obtain that information, the next step then is to sort of do something similar to what we did in step 2 here, where we simulated from the prior to see what things looked like. But now we're saying, okay, now that we've learned something from the data, we've updated our priors, we have maybe more precise sort of estimates of the parameters in the model that we're interested in. Now let's see if we can sort of simulate data that looks more consistent with what we actually observed than previously. And in this stage, we might find that a whole host of things could go wrong. Like maybe we made a bug in our code, or we sort of like the model was just doing a really bad job. And so if that's the case, then we might have to go back to step 1. And so what I wanted to sort of demonstrate with this idea of a Bayesian workflow is that, it's sort of this iterative process where we'll sort of come up with a model of how we think something might work. And then we're kind of going through these checks to see if it's producing behavior that we'd expect. And then this way, at the end of the day, we can be more confident in any inferences that we might derive from the model. Okay, so that's the basic idea that we want to do. For our example, I'll talk about sort of a specific problem. And here, I'm in the, my interests are in clinical psychology. I'm really interested in impulsivity. And so we're going to use this example here where, maybe the inference that I want to make is like this difference in impulsivity between people with versus without a history of chronic substance use. So we could approach this question in many different ways. And in this case, I have some data from the Iowa gambling task. I'm not sure how many people here are familiar with this task, but the basic idea here is that we have you have 4 choices that you can make on each trial. And these are just these different decks. So A, B, C, and D. And what I'm showing you on, I guess the y-axis here, if we think of this as a graph, is like what you could expect if you were to pick each deck on each trial, right? And so you get different amounts. And at the end, if you were to pick deck A and B in the long term, the expected value of continuing to pick those decks, you end up like losing a lot of money in the task. And so we consider A and B like bad decks, for lack of a better word. And then C and D lead to these long-term gains, right? And so we consider those good decks, right? And so this is sort of the observed data that we have in the task is, whether or not you picked a good or a bad deck on each trial. Right, and I just want to know if there's a difference between groups in sort of your likelihood of picking a good or a bad deck. And so in this data set, so this is data from Woo-Young An, and it's a paper 2014, and we have 48 healthy controls and 38 individuals with past stimulant use disorder. And so at the end of the day, the inference that we want to make is, whether or not there's a group difference in how they're selecting good versus bad decks. So that's the basic idea here. All right, and so to begin, I thought it would be useful just to go through how we might typically analyze this type of data and then contrast that with the sort of Bayesian approach that we'll discuss. And so here, so this is just an example of sort of data in like a long format that we might collect from this task. And we have some various different columns that we might have. Like here we have trial number. So here we're just showing the first 10 trials for this one participant, and they're in the control group. And then we have this last column over here that indicates whether or not they selected a bad deck on this trial. Right, and so it's a 0 if they selected a good deck and a 1 if they selected the bad deck. And we're interested in this column, and like normally how we might analyze this is I might just sort of take these and I'll compute like the proportion of these that are 1 for each person. So like for each person I, and maybe for this one participant it's 0.43. So 43 of the 100 trials they selected the bad deck. Right, so that might be sort of what we would do to sort of get some information on how this individual person is sort of behaving. And then we do this for each person. And then here I might demonstrate, I might just plot out in a histogram. Here we have that proportion for each person and color coded by group. And what you can see is that, So this gray distribution is of the controls, and the red is of those in the amphetamine use group. And I mean, they're all kind of like between 0.2, like there's this maybe one person who's got like a little higher than the rest. There doesn't really seem to be any like particular pattern here, but traditionally we might analyze this if we wanted to approach this from the point of view of sort of estimating mean differences in groups. We might do a t-test, right? So that would be a pretty natural way to try to answer this question. And if we do that, two-sample t-test, we get like a p-value of 0.08, and then we might sort of from this conclude that, well, there's not a significant difference between groups, and so we're sort of done there. And that's really the way that we might traditionally approach this type of data, right? And so when we think about how we want to approach this question from the Bayesian perspective, I think it's useful to kind of back up a little bit and think about like what I'll call the data generating process, which includes all of our knowledge about like the experiment that we conducted, like the paradigm itself, but then also like any theories that we have about like why a person might be choosing, good or bad decks, like more or less. And so some basic things that we know about data collection, this is just sort of going back to some of the things that we already went over when I showed you the data, but we know that there are 100 trials, or not elections, I should say selections, made by each person, and that the observed outcomes that we see are binary, right? Like you either chose good or chose bad. And so that's sort of information that we want to be able to, like we would like to be able to simulate like zeros and ones, like whether or not you're selecting good or bad on each trial. And so that's what our model should be kind of capturing. And then we might be considering some things just about impulsivity and behavior in general. And so, coming from sort of some of the clinical theories, like maybe, we believe that each person has some like latent impulsivity trait or like propensity to engage in impulsive behaviors. And we think that, just a person who's high in impulsivity or who engages in impulsive behavior quite frequently, it's not all the time, it's probabilistic because behavior is kind of really complex and kind of random. But that's sort of what we think. We think there's something underlying the person that gives rise to this behavior that we observe in a task. And in this case, we believe that people who are higher in impulsivity should maybe produce like more of the bad deck selections across the trials. In this current context, right? There's some other stuff that we might consider, like, there's some ideas that trait impulsivity is this dimensional trait that, I have a certain level of impulsivity and you have a certain level of impulsivity, and we're all sort of along this continuous distribution. So we'll kind of come back to that point later, but that's also stuff that we might want to consider when we're kind of thinking about a model here. Okay, so these are just some basic ideas that we might kind of start with. And then, so kind of revisiting the data, what we observe in the task in our experiment is just, this column, zeros and ones, right? And so the sort of first question to ask here is like, how do we come up with a way to kind of like simulate zeros and ones like within a person? And like, how could we generate that data? Like, what is a model that could produce that? And one of the ways that we can actually think about this is we can view each of these trials. So here, like bad is just indicating whether or not a person selected like the bad deck, and T is just the trial. So like bad for T1 for this, so we're only thinking of this one person for now. So like bad T when T equals 1 is just 0, and then T2 is 0, and sort of so on. And we can think of each of these trials as us sort of like flipping a coin, right? And you can imagine that instead of landing heads or tails, it's 1 for bad equals 1 and 0. And then underlying that is this value P, which is sort of the probability of a 1 arising as opposed to a 0. And it's sort of like a biased coin flip, right? So if I had like a loaded die or like I guess a loaded coin, then a higher value for P would mean that that ones are occurring more frequently. And so you can actually do this in R, for those of you who are familiar. I'm not gonna like go through the code in a ton of detail, but I just wanted to demonstrate sort of how you might approach this. And you can kind of ignore this part. R actually doesn't have like something that just does this function. So I kind of made my own real quick here. But what we can do is we can kind of simulate like a Bernoulli trial, like one flip of this biased coin with, if the underlying probability is 0.1, we can simulate like 100 trials. And what that might look like is something like this, right? Like, so we're gonna get some zeros and ones over here. And what we could then do is say, okay, like we simulated this data, and then if I just kind of compute the proportion of those that are bad, like we can imagine like maybe it's 0.05. And then you can imagine like doing this again, right? So we simulate another time, and maybe now it's like 0.08, right? And so we could do this over and over again, and what we would end up with in this case is sort of a bunch of different sort of observed proportions of bad decks selected, despite the fact that like p was equal to 0.1 in all of these cases, right? And so I think that's one of the important concepts about like building some of these models, is that by doing this, we're sort of making the assumption that even if there is this the single value p that underlies someone's behavior, if they were to kind of do the task multiple times, if we don't assume that they're learning or something like that, even if p is the same, you're going to see different. You're going to sort of like realize or observe different outcomes, just because this is probabilistic. It's like flipping a coin. And so this is just doing that repeatedly 100 times, and this is the distribution that you get. And I'm highlighting 0.5 here just to show you kind of give sort of like a midline that you might see. But you can also kind of look at what this might look like across different values for p, right? So if p is 0.5, you might get a distribution that looks something like this, or p 0.3, something like this. And in all cases, what we actually would observe for any given like run through the task, it could have come from many different values for p. And when we are doing a Bayesian data analysis, what we want to know is, say, given this is my model of behavior, like what is the most likely value for p that could have generated it? And that's sort of the core question that we're answering when we're doing Bayesian data analysis. And so the idea here, so this model is essentially what we might call the likelihood in a Bayesian data analysis. And then what we need to do then is think about, we've specified how the observed data might arise from some underlying probability, but then like where does this probability come from? And so that's where the prior comes into play. And I know this kind of looks strange, but I'll talk about this in a second. But we have our likelihood here, and then our prior. And again, we're still thinking about just one person's data. And what we're assuming here is that, we're assuming this normal distribution on this probability, but it's on a different scale than the natural scale. And so basically, p needs to be between 0 and 1 because it's a probability. And so we need some way of assigning a prior distribution to it that will actually capture that assumption. And so if you've ever done logistic regression before, you've probably done something, you've unintentionally used this before. And so this, so you can show what this prior looks like on logit p here, right? So this is just what it might look like. This is just our sort of typical normal distribution that we're kind of familiar with. But then if you were to show what this actually looks like on the scale of p, so it's approximately uniform. And so that's why I chose this like sort of weird number. And so basically what this prior is saying in this context is that, like before we've seen any data, we haven't looked at any of the participants, we think the probability of sort of choosing a good versus a bad deck could be anywhere between 0 and 1. And any value is kind of equally likely, right? And that's sort of the idea that this prior is capturing. And right, so this basically what's happening is if you look through the notebook that I linked, I go into a little bit more detail on exactly what the transformations are here and how to better interpret that. So I'd encourage you to check that out if you're interested in. But I think the core concept here is that we've assigned a prior distribution on P, and it's more or less uniform across any value. And so we don't really expect anything in particular. Okay, and so because that's a little abstract, right? We've talked about what the prior might look like on the parameter P, but what does that actually look like in terms of like the data that we might observe in the actual experiment? And this is where the concept of a prior predictive check or simulation comes into play. And so the basic idea here is that I may first start by sampling this normal distribution. So in R, I would just draw one sample from a normal distribution with a mean of 0, and then a standard deviation of this strange number here. And then I'll get some value, and then I plug that into the likelihood, and then I simulate the sort of observed data from the likelihood. And so that's sort of the steps that we might take. And then if you do that for all of the 100 trials, then I could summarize that just like I did in the previous slides when I was computing sort of the proportion that we observe of bad deck selections. And then you could do that over and over again, right? So taking different samples from the prior, kind of running it through the likelihood here. And then at the end of the day, what we get is what we'll call this prior predictive distribution, which tells us like what our model actually expects to see in the observed data that we're going to make inference on. And so if we basically do this, I think I ran this like 100 times or more. What you'll see here is the pink here, the lighter red, is the simulated quantities that kind of come from this of the proportion of bad deck selections. And then I'm just for scale, I'm putting this is our random, our subject 103, just the random person that I'm using as the example here. This was like the number that they actually selected. So at this stage, we haven't actually like estimated the model parameters. We haven't updated them. The model is unaware of what the observed data should look like, but we're just sort of sampling from the prior in the likelihood just to see like before we see any data, like what are some things that our model might predict about your like a random participant. And the key kind of thing to note here is that it's kind of uniform, right? And it should be because our prior was uniform, is that, we're sort of equally likely to see a person pick all bad or pick all good or pick like half and half or really anywhere in between. So this is sort of like what the model expects to see in the data before we see any. And so this is a useful thing to do just to get a sense of like, have I selected priors that are reasonable for the inference that I'm trying to make? Because I think one thing that can easily go wrong is when, at least when I first started doing Bayesian data analysis kind of stuff, you sort of don't want to make your priors too informative, right? Like I showed you that paper at the very beginning that said something along the lines of, if you're using informative prior information, then you're doing data falsification. And I don't want to do that. And so, so you might say like, okay, well, I'm going to make my prior like really diffuse, right? Like this normal distribution with like this really big standard deviation. And I think that's like pretty typical when people maybe start to do this. But if you assign this this prior and you do these prior predictive simulations, what you actually get is something that looks more like this. And so so sort of just doing the same thing, but instead of using that previous distribution, I'm using this normal 0, 10 on the P. And what ends up happening is because of some of the weird transformations that are going on here, the model is actually predicting before seeing any data that it's much more likely that people are going to be like choosing all bad decks or all good decks and sort of almost all bad or good, but very little in between. And so this is sort of one of the reasons why I think doing, kind of after specifying a model, just sort of like drawing some samples from it just to see what it's making predictions about can be really useful and really important when we're trying to better understand the implications of our assumptions. Because this is probably not good. It's going to give us some inference that is maybe biased a little bit. Okay, and so the key concept to kind of take away from this part is just that, it may look non-informative because it's really wide, but actually this can be quite informative at times. Okay, so now you've seen I've changed it to this normal 0, 1, and I can kind of try this again and see what happens. And this time, what I'm getting is something that's sort of more concentrated around 0.5, which in this case, if we think back to the task, so in this task, if you were to respond completely randomly on each trial, like we would expect you to have like, half and half good and bad selections. And so it's probably more reasonable to assume that we expect kind of more of the observations to be kind of closer to 0.5 than all one or all bad decks or all good decks. And because that would sort of require our participants to learn like really rapidly what the sort of best responses in the task are, and that's pretty unreasonable assumption, at least in this context. And so this prior is sort of more conservative. It's sort of saying that we are going to expect to see people sort of more having a preference for either or, but not one or the other. And that's I'm more happy with that. And so I've put my little happy face here. And I think the more important thing is that we don't have something that looks like this, which is completely maybe not what I expect. I mean, unless it is, like maybe you do expect everyone to pick one or the other option, but that wasn't my expectation for this. And so this is more consistent with what I would say my domain knowledge is in this context. Okay, and so after we're kind of happy with the model itself, the next step is to actually fit it to data. And so I have a lot of examples in that notebook that I shared at the beginning, but what I wanted to show you is sort of just like a little snippet of the code that's actually used to do this. And I'm using this package that I'll talk a little bit more about at the end called rethinking, but it allows you to specify the model pretty similar to what you see in the notation here, which is kind of nice. So I'm sort of defining the model, getting just this subject's data, and then kind of fitting the model to the data. And so this is actually where all of the sort of Bayes rule stuff comes into play. And I wasn't actually going to show Bayes rule or anything. So this might be the first talk you ever see where somebody talks about Bayes, but doesn't show the Bayesian rule, because I actually don't have to, I don't have to do it by hand, right? I sort of define my model and then I can estimate it. And what's happening is the model is estimating, given that I've observed the data, now what should I update my priors to look like? And then we call that a posterior at the end. And so what ends up happening, so if we take this model, and I'm just showing you again the prior predictions for this one person, right? So this is what we had in the slide before, but then after fitting it, if you do the same thing that we did before, but instead of sampling from the prior, we sample from the posterior to see like what the model expects after seeing the data, you get something that looks more like this. So basically what's happened here is that the model, we've learned something about this individual, this person's probability of responding to bad decks. And because of that, now our predictions for what this person might, like what the observed data for this person might look like, are now sort of more precise and centered around the value that we actually observed them choose. But I think it's important to notice that there's still some, we're not completely certain. So the model is acknowledging that if this person were to kind of take the task again, we could see anything reasonably within this distribution, and that would still be within our expectation, right? And so this is sort of how I usually go through my analyses, is looking at, what does the model predict before? What does it predict after? Like we've learned something about this participant. And now we might want to interpret the parameters of the model in some way, right? So, the whole idea here was to estimate that P, so this probability of responding to, or of making bad deck selections, and then see if that's different across people. But in this case, we'll start with just this one person, and we'll say, so I'll show you here, this is the prior distribution on P for this individual versus the posterior. And what you can see is that this prior is just this normal distribution, and it's pretty wide. But then after we see the data, the posterior has now become more concentrated and much sort of denser around where the actual proportion of bad deck selections was for this person. And So I wanted to get in some info about Bayes factors. And so this is where I'll talk about some Bayes factors because, one of the things that we might want to do here, if we wanted to do some form of like null hypothesis or point null hypothesis type of testing in the Bayesian framework, this is one of the ways that you can use Bayes factors. And so, for example, so here, maybe our alternative might be that like a person is just like responding randomly in the task, which could be like the p is equal to 0.5, right? They're not even looking at the dex, they're just picking whatever. And so our null might be that p is equal to 0.5, and then our alternative might be that it's not equal to 0.5. And what you can actually do, we can compute a Bayes factor that tells us, that gives us the evidence for one or the other. And one of the ways that you can do this is actually, I like the visual appeal of doing this, but there's this idea called the Savage-Dickey density ratio for computing a Bayes factor. And what this does is all we have to do is look at our null value at 0.5, at what the height of the posterior is versus the height of the prior. And that ratio gives us the Bayes factor for the null over the alternative. And in this case, the value is like 2.23. And what this actually translates to is, there are different ways we can think about this, but the data are about 2 times more likely under the null after having observed the data than what we expected beforehand. And so the Bayes factor used in this way kind of tells us like how much we've learned or how much we've updated our expectations of a certain parameter, like at a specific value. And this is sort of, there are ways to interpret this, like people have cutoffs similar to what we might have for like large, small, medium effect sizes. I'm not going to actually go over those, but I have a link in the R notebook if you wanted to take a look at that. I actually don't really use Bayes factors in my own research, but they can be useful to sort of tell me how much I've learned or how much my expectations have been updated after seeing the data. And here I'm using them sort of testing this idea of this hypothesis that like p is equal to some null versus or 0.5 versus not, but they can also be used for model comparison, which is something that John Kruschke is going to talk quite extensively about next week. Now, another concept that's often used in Bayesian data analysis, this is the idea of a highest density interval. And so, this is an idea that's similar to the concept of a confidence interval, but it's a little different in the interpretation, and I put it here. But basically, so if I say I have a 95% highest density interval, what it means is that the interval contains 95% of the distribution, and all of the points inside it are more likely or more probable than all of the points outside of it. So it's sort of like if you think of the mode being the most likely point, the HDI is like an interval of the most likely points. And I know this is also, John Kruschke uses a lot of these, in his doing Bayesian data analysis book, he talks a lot about like how to do hypothesis testing with HDIs, but we can also use them similarly to how we might use confidence intervals, just to sort of kind of ascertain like how certain we are in our estimate of PI. Because here you can see that it's quite wide, right? So PI could still be kind of within this interval somewhere. And we'd need more data to be more sure where it is exactly. Okay, so that was all thinking about one participant, right? And it seems like we've done a lot of work just to analyze one participant's data. And so what I'm going to make a little change. You'll see a small change in the notation. So just like look carefully. All right, and so so what you'll see is I added an I here. So now we have participant I and trial T, and now we're going to estimate a different P for each participant. And we're going to use the same prior. So basically what I can show you now is, like before I was showing you the prior predictions on the scale of just one person, and I was showing a histogram. But now that I've talked about the highest density interval, that's what I'm showing you here for each person. And the light is sort of, it's the 80% HDI, and the dark is the 50% HDI. And what I'm showing you is the prior predictions for all participants, like with this assumed prior. So really, this is exactly the same information that I was showing for one participant, but just for all of them at the same time. And I'm also putting down their actual proportion of bad deck selections, just to give you a scale of sort of what we're dealing with in terms of the actual observed data. But what you'll see is, the predictions for each participant are basically the same. Our prior is sort of centered around 0.5, so we don't really know, right? But again, these seem reasonable based on our expectations before seeing the data. And then what happens is when we fit the model to data, what should happen is our prediction should get sort of more centered around the observed data, right? So the simulated should start to match the observed. And so if I fit this model to data, which I have the example for that again in our notebook, you'll see in the code that it's very similar to what this looks like. It's looks very similar to the code I showed before. What happens now is our posterior predictions become kind of shrunken around the actual observed data that we saw. And so I have them ordered here just so that you can kind of see what's happening. There's not really a whole lot to take away from this other than that, after fitting the model to data, our posteriors become more precise for each person, and we're able to sort of estimate or sort of simulate their data with more fidelity. And I don't know, maybe this person is like somewhat more impulsive than the rest of the group up here, but that's about all I can take away from this plot. And so this is so now we've talked about like how we might analyze multiple participants, but remember we were interested in group differences, and so how might we ask that question, right? Because right now we're just sort of estimating each person's value for p, but not really doing anything with the groups. And so that's where I'll take this next step, which is actually pretty interesting. So again, I'll make a small change in the notation here, and so watch. Okay, so before, when I was showing this, I just when we were deciding our prior, I just sort of like set the mean to 0 and the standard deviation to 1. But we can actually estimate those. So we can estimate the parameters in the prior distribution, which may seem strange, but I'll get into some more information about that soon. But the basic idea is that now our prior distribution on the person level effects now functions as sort of our group level model. So we can actually use this to estimate the differences between group means. And so the basic idea here is that for each person, we have this sort of regression equation, and group I here is just going to be an indicator that is 0 if you're in the control group and 1 if you're in the substance use group. And so what this means is that, so if we just picture this as a control participant, this participant I, then what happens is this is 0, and then mu I is just beta naught. And so what that means, so that's the mean. So beta naught is sort of the mean of the control group. And then when this is turned on, we have the mean of the control group plus this beta weight here. And so this is essentially a group difference, beta 1. And so this is, beta 1 is now the difference between the control and substance use group. And so now, as opposed to just setting this to some value, we're actually estimating it with this regression model here. And this is essentially a logistic regression model. And so beta 0 and beta 1 are on the same scale, like the log odds scale, that if you're familiar with logistic regression, then this is sort of the idea here. And now, so yeah, we have our beta weights. I should have put that up earlier. So we have our beta weights, and now you might say, well now, so now we have this group level model. It's like sort of still a prior. It's like a prior for p, but now we need to put priors on these other parameters, which is the standard deviation and the beta weights. And I won't get into too much detail there, but we can do that in the same way that we've done for other parameters in the model, right? So before we said like normal 0, 1 is on p, but now we're just assigning the prior distributions to the coefficients in this equation. And here the sigma needs to be positive, and so that's why there's a log here. But again, it's hard to interpret this, right? Like if I just look at this model and say like, what would happen if I were to simulate data from this? It's kind of hard to say, right? And so that's why we can just sort of run our prior predictions. Oh, and I forgot to mention, so I've sort of snuck in hierarchical Bayesian analysis here. I think we often might hear this word, and it seems like, you know, there might be a lot going on there, but really this idea of like estimating parameters in a prior, this is what makes this model hierarchical. And so now like each person comes from a group, and it could be the control or the substance use group, and that group is going to become the prior. And so it sort of constrains what we might observe for each person. But again, we want to sort of see what this model suggests. And so we can kind of go back and run our prior predictive checks. And this looks pretty much identical to what we had before. So it shouldn't look too much different. I mean, one thing that is noticeable if you go compare this to the one that we had before is there's a little more uncertainty actually, because now the sort of prior predictive intervals span across like even this really impulsive person, which I don't think they did before. And that's because now we have like the uncertainty in beta naught, the uncertainty in beta 1. And so we have more uncertainty. So there's sort of more uncertainty in the prior predictions. But then after we fit it to data, which again, there's example code of that in the R notebook, then we get these posterior predictions, which again, look pretty similar to what we had when we were not estimating sort of these group differences with this sort of form of the model up here. But, you know, given that the model seems to be able to capture the data relatively well here, now we can go back and try to interpret the parameters. Right, so similar to what we did before, we plotted the prior versus the posteriors for P for one person. Now we're interested in beta naught and beta 1, which are telling us something about the group level effects. And so these coefficients are, you know, between they're sort of unbounded, so they're not between 0 and 1 like P is. But in this case, as you might be able to see, so at our null, where so our null hypothesis here, I showed beta naught here. It's not really of interest. What's really interesting is this group difference parameter, right? And so our null hypothesis might be that the group difference is equal to 0. And our alternative would be that it's not equal to 0. And then the ratio of the posterior density to the prior density gives us that Bayes factor. And I didn't actually even bother calculating it here because, as you can see, the dots are like right on top of each other. And so the Bayes factor in this case is approximately 1. And we've essentially come to, like, what that means is that we don't really have convincing evidence in favor of the null, but we don't have convincing evidence for the alternative either. We really, for this null value of 0 difference in the group means, we've essentially learned nothing at that specific value from our prior to our posterior. And I think I like this example because it demonstrates something about Bayes factors, which is, you know, clearly we've learned a lot. Like, this posterior has become much more precise. And so we have a better idea of like what this group difference might be. But in terms of the Bayes factor in this case, we haven't learned much at all. And so this is why I think some of these multiple different methods of thinking about Bayesian models can be helpful, because then, you know, I could look at the HDI, which I know in this picture it's really small, but looking at the HDIs here, in this case, again, the 95% highest density interval does contain 0. So, you know, if we're kind of treating this similar to how we would a confidence interval, then we might sort of say that we failed to reject the null. But in the Bayesian world, you know, we can still say that the majority of the posterior is over 0. So it's, you know, there's potentially a group difference, but it's not really clear, right? Like, maybe if we had more data, we could be more certain and make more calibrated inference on that. But there's a lot of uncertainty right now. And it seems that more or less the groups are performing pretty similarly. And so, you know, so we went through all of that. And we came to kind of a similar conclusion as we did with the sort of traditional frequentist t-test approach that I described at the very beginning, right? And the main conclusion that we kind of are taking away from this analysis is that, you know, we didn't really find convincing evidence of group level mean differences between our groups. And the last slide, there was some evidence that if I were to go back, that like the HDI was sort of below 0 for the controls, like that their group mean, in which this indicates that they're choosing the good decks more frequently than the bad decks on average. But again, there wasn't really a difference between groups, and so it's something that we found there. But there's also just a lot of heterogeneity, right? So the participants were very different from one another, and that itself is suggestive of some future directions that we might take the model in. And so that's actually something that I wanted to maybe touch on at the end. And this is where I think sort of the idea of doing Bayesian data analysis is that, you know, we've gone through all this work to define this model, and now it's really easy to think about how we might extend it to potentially better account for the data or to better match our theory. And this is something that I think sometimes is missing with the traditional approach, right? We might find that there's a null effect, and we might have to move on to thinking about like different problems. But with the Bayesian data analysis, now we can start to think about like different ways to analyze the data. Like, for example, before, when I showed you we were estimating a difference in group level means, we assumed that the standard deviation was the same for groups. But we could do something very similar to what we did earlier for the group level standard deviation. And so maybe, if we found that there, like one group was highly variable and the other was not, like that could be interesting in and of itself. We also might try to account for some learning effects in the task. So maybe as opposed to just estimating like a single probability of certain person performing like a bad or good deck selection, like we might try to estimate changes in that across trials, because maybe that's actually more consistent with sort of the theory of impulsivity in this case. And another thing that kind of is brought up here is that if we really think that impulsivity is normally distributed at the population, well, does it really make sense to assume that, or to estimate like a difference between normal distributions in the group means of both like our substance use group and our control group? Like maybe it would make more sense to approach this question from an individual difference perspective. So like, as opposed to just estimating like a group difference, maybe we're interested in some like continuous like self-report trait that we have, and we can look at sort of the relationship between some continuous trait measure and the underlying probability of responding bad for each person. So something that looks kind of more like this, right? And so those are just some ideas for possible extensions that we might make to the model to kind of better capture some of our theories and allow us to dig deeper into the problem. Okay, so I wanted to kind of like wrap up what we went over today. So just in terms of like what Bayesian data analysis allows us to do, I mean, we really have to think about how the data that we're analyzing might arise or how they might be generated. And I think that's like a really big key benefit of actually doing Bayesian data analysis and taking up this philosophy, because we start to realize what assumptions we're making and how they might be sort of different from what our theories are suggesting. And this allows us to kind of explore our data in much more detail. And by doing this, we can actually construct models that better align with our theories. So we can, we developed this model today where, we're estimating what's going on for each participant, but then also the groups that those participants were within. And so we're able to sort of explore the data and understand it at a level that's just not afforded by other methods when we were just doing that t-test. And then a few other things is, the fact that we can use these models to simulate data is actually really useful for us to not only understand like how our statistical models perform, but also like what the implications of the models are for our theories, right? And I think we kind of touched on some of that when we were doing those simulations earlier with the priors. And then I just wanted to final note, like for people who are really interested in digging more, I know this was like a really fast course sort of overview of like what a sort of Bayesian data analysis might look like. But there's this book, Statistical Rethinking, that I think does a really good job of like introducing the core concepts and sort of the philosophy of Bayesian stats that sometimes are hard to get in other more advanced textbooks. And despite that, it goes through some pretty interesting and complicated models, but it kind of builds off some really simple principles that you don't even have to have taken a statistics class, I think, to start working through this book. He also has lectures available online if you're interested in. So it's been big influence for me. So I thought I'd give a shout out here. But yeah, so that wraps up what I had to share with everyone today. So I guess I should stop sharing my screen real quick. Yeah, so I'm happy to talk about any questions. Like I said, I know it was kind of fast going over all that information. So
Thank you very much, Nate. It's great. Give Nate a hand, please. Questions for Nate? Please ask.
Or if not, I'm going to start. So anyway, thank you very much. You do a very nice talks. It's covered a lot of stuff. The prior predictive, post predictive, hierarchical base, and in particular, I like your last slide, the wrap up, so that when you do Bayesian analysis, it actually forces you to think more about this, the models and then also theoretical hypothesis, this and that. Not like the hypothesis testing, which is very simple-minded, and you look at the p-value, and then they're trying to interpret this. Well, you can go a lot beyond that. Try this, try that, and that's very good. And I think that's really the power of the Bayesian analysis. But
yeah,
well, thank you for that. But I think I kind of disagree with your final conclusion where you said that, when you look at this beta posterior, and that include the hypothesis, the confidence interval include the zero, you say no. But I think it's that actually p-values say, or you cannot say no versus alternative. Look at the beta 1 posterior, it tells you that actually there looks like there's a effect, okay, group difference, okay, yeah, and which is you don't get that information from hypothesis testing, right? So you think that there's some indication that there's maybe that the impulsivity and that can play a role for this the patient group, for example, yeah. And so I think that's how I mean, I want to say there's no evidence. I think there's some indication of there's a good effect, good differences.
sure.
And so for still distribution, not centered on the zeros, can tilt them more to the right, all right?
Right. No, definitely. And I would agree. And I think, yeah, so like the Bayes factor sort of suggested we hadn't really learned anything about that particular null. But it's true, like the HDI was like, the majority of the posteriors over 0, and that does tell us something. And who knows, maybe we'd collect more data and you'd actually be able to see that it is above 0. And I think, so yeah, no, I'd agree with that.
So, I mean, this is where it's a little ambiguous. Nate might have said this, but Jay's convinced there's an effect, and Nate's not quite sure. Right?
Well, that's the beauty of the Bayes,
right?
all right? So not like you get the P is like written 0.505, so there's no effect. No, it depends, all right? So that
Right.
you get the posterior and you interpret the way that you want and you write about it, then they show you actually posterior, right?
Right, and I think that's the nice thing, right? Like, yeah, you could say like this % of the posterior is above 0, and like do with that what you will. Like if I were to make a bet, I would probably bet on the side of like probably there is an effect because most of the probability is saying so, and so that's sort of like yeah, definitely something interesting to think about. And I definitely agree with that idea that like the frequentist sort of approach at the beginning, like, even in the time that I spent on it, it was like, what, 5 minutes? And so it takes a lot longer, I think, to think about things in terms of like a full generative model of how my data could arise. But then like all those potential extensions at the very end are much more apparent because I did that. And so it's sort of like, even if I were to find evidence of a null effect, I'm thinking like, well, there are so many other ways that I could have approached this that might be more consistent with like what I believe is actually happening. Like if my theory of impulsivity says that there's one normal distribution and people who are really high are just like on the extreme end, then it doesn't really make sense to estimate different means in normal distributions to see if one group is higher than the other, because they're not actually groups. Like maybe if I take that dimensional approach, looking at correlations for like some individual difference measure, that might actually make more sense. So that's the type of thing that like it doesn't necessarily come to mind for me when I'm taking a frequentist approach or traditional approach, that becomes really apparent because I've just like written out the model and I'm thinking like that doesn't actually align with that assumption that I wrote out at the very beginning. And so, maybe that's a way to kind of improve on things next time.
Someone else like to ask Nate a question?
Do you not worry about identifiability in Bayesian models? Because
So
I would say in your workflow, you should probably include that, but you also need to know what identifiability is and explain it. And so
yeah,
forth.
definitely.
So,
I mean, I there's only so much that I could like reasonably fit in
Yep.
here.
Understandably.
And yeah, but no, that's true, because what you can actually do, and that's sort of like a part of the so like you can actually just do those prior predictive simulations and then like do
Yeah.
one iteration of that and take what results you get and then fit the model with those and see. So it's really nice, because if you can simulate data from your model, then you can simulate, and then you can fit that data, and then you can see if it's recovering what you simulated initially. And so there's a really nice loop that you can use to make sure that we might call that like parameter recovery simulations in cognitive science. But you can sort of do that to make sure that your model is like performing as you might expect. And that's definitely an important piece. There's some modern work on that, like they call it, I think the Stand group calls it, and Gelman and folks calls it like simulation-based calibration, where you sort of do that repeatedly from your prior simulations and fit it over and over again, and just make sure that like across that, all those different sort of samples, you get the sort of recovery that you would expect. And that can be really important.
Yeah, I think that also helps for detecting bugs as well. So that kind of last step at detecting bugs, it's either A, my model is not identifiable, or if I've done something very wrong.
Yeah, I think I always do something wrong when I first, because I mean, if you're not fitting, if you're not just doing like LM and R, you're probably going to mess something up. And so it's sort of, I do think that's nice, is like doing the prior predictives and all of that, you can catch that a lot easier. Because when I first started doing this, there were times where I'd like go like almost fully through a project with a model that I had like very badly misspecified, and I only caught it when really going through the results, and I was like, oh man, back to square one. And so that's why I think that sort of going through the workflow up front is really important, because I've learned the lesson the hard way. You want to think that it's easier just to like go through and get the results, but it's not good.
If anyone doesn't have another question, I can shoot another one at you.
Sure, Noah, go ahead.
Yeah, so there's the thing of informed versus diffuse priors, and you kind of went with something that I think is pretty objectively diffuse. You can argue that it's diffuse, but what if I wanted to use an informed prior? So that posterior is still valid, right? And then, I could use multiple informed priors. So how do you feel about making, instead of just a single posterior and publishing that, maybe software, so that way people can put in their own priors and then see what their posterior looks like?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think you see a lot of applied papers will do like some sort of like prior sensitivity analysis, stuff like that. And so it's definitely something that you can do. Yeah, and I think for me, it's sort of like, I think of the prior itself as like a model that I should be sort of checking and scrutinizing and that sort of thing. And so, I think it's definitely important to kind of know what the implications are. Like, would I make a different inference if I were to use like a diffuse versus a really informed prior? But like there are certain areas in cognitive science, especially, where like having informed priors is actually really important. And things like when you're fitting like evidence accumulation models, or like complicated models that we have studied for a long time, there might be certain parameters like a drift rate or like a non-decision time or like whatever it might be. We might know more or less like what the distribution should look like. And I think the example that I gave today kind of shows that, like, if I'm just making inference on an individual, the prior is like the group level. And that's sort of the kind of main idea of hierarchical Bayes. And so like you can sort of, so we can kind of take that knowledge that we have of like what people look like in general and sort of put it into these models in the form of priors. And I think often that's actually more helpful than sort of assuming you know nothing up front and then